all of the organizers and departments that played a major part in putting together today's symposium, of course, for funders as well. If nothing else comes of this, the exchange of ideas is always healthy. It calls us to critical self-reflection about the work that we do, but we don't do enough of that in a culture that is primarily anti-intellectual and is far more interested in profits than people. So now you know where I'm coming from. Also want to thank Jeffrey Butts for his commitment to allowing an outsider such as myself to really ask, I think, some slightly different questions of the work that we do collectively and commitments certainly that we all have to justice and equity in our society. So I appreciate that. There are a couple of things I wanted to mention very quickly, just because I figure once I get into the meat and potatoes of my formal comments, I won't get back to this. I want to just point out that Ruben Austria and Marlon Peterson said some things that were very impactful to me, and they're going to echo in this talk. So I wanted to signal at this time why I think they're important, and that is that the way in which we disaggregate not just our humanity through the quantitative methods that are privileged as the basis of what we call evidence. So that disaggregation is also in the work that we do, in the casual way in which we accept the terms of who does what, and what the juvenile justice system can do, or what youth justice is about, or what our educators do. I would say to all of you, innovation should not come at the expense of common sense, because at the end of the day, if educators who are shaping educational policy aren't in the room, and if those who are responsible for making decisions about the kinds of tax policies that shape the economic fortunes of those who live in our society are not in the room, then you're always going to be working at the margins, I would argue. I run a program. It's not obvious to all of you, and I don't think of myself as a program person. I run a research library with a really big footprint in terms of the many things that we do. But frankly, in a space like this, it is important to say that my program has been going for 11 years. It serves 125 to 150 kids every year. Those kids come to the Schomburg Center every single Saturday from roughly 10 o'clock to 3 o'clock, from October to May, covering just about the entire school year. It costs me just over $100,000 to do it, and I pay for it out of my general operating budget. Because it's important for me to teach to the wholeness of a child what isn't happening in our schools. The fact that they don't have art education, that they are not being taught a history of the communities from which they come from. And if you don't begin to think about the relationship of the consciousness that children have about who they are and where they fit in the world, then you're already at the tail end of a process that will yield limited results. And so I want to encourage you all, when Ruben or Marlon talked about there's no money for the work of the good kids in the neighborhood. I don't think of our kids as the good kids. We just simply think of those kids in need of something I call historical literacy, a sense of place and purpose in the world, as a basis for a social and critical analysis of the world that they live in. I mean, you can't accept those terms. You can't leave yourself operating at the margins of what is necessary to deal with the wholeness of the child. Let me give you another example. Why is it that innovation happens, quote unquote, in public education in K through 12? So we could reproduce the same context here in public education, and there will be educational researchers with program evaluations of curriculum mandates and all sorts of ways in which we teach children. And yet, no such apparatus exists in college preparatory, in elite private schools. No such apparatus exists in higher education. Why? Because we take as a given that the simple exposure to a menu of opportunities about where someone fits in the world is the basis for them finding their own humanity on their journey. We don't evaluate whether liberal arts in higher ed should look the same as it did 125 years ago when it came to me. No one questions it. Now, some state legislators recently have begun questioning whether it's too expensive. But the simple fact is those same hypocrites will send their children off to a liberal arts education to make sure they have the basis for class mobility and privilege in American society. So I think if I leave you with nothing else, remind yourself to take a step back and take a look at the big picture and think about the ways in which privileges are doled out and categories of analysis are meant to rationalize or justify inequality. I also will finish with my kind of platform soapbox tirade here in the early parts of this formal speech to ask this question. Why is scientific evidence so ineffective against policies such as fossil fuel, energy policy, climate change, fiscal stimulus, spending, death penalty, gun control? In other words, there are very big questions in our society that have everything to do with ideas, ideology, and politics, and have nothing to do with evidence. And that's come up a little bit today. But again, I want to push the envelope and caution you to some of these battles and some of the ways in which things are framed have nothing to do with a kind of objective, value-neutral set of frameworks that we use to create benchmarks and outcomes. It has everything to do with a set of ideas that we rely upon to define who are winners and who are losers. And that brings me to my formal comments. There is no moment in America's past when, in this case, African Americans, since the end of slavery, were not stigmatized as criminals. In fact, if we're going to have a conversation about the cultural roots of youth justice in America, then those roots are incredibly important to the branches that, for many of us, choke us out of the energy and the passion that we bring to wanting to save lives, wanting to help and to be relevant to individuals. So what is it about those cultural roots that we either pay no attention to, we have no consciousness of, we forgot, or we were never taught? Why does it matter for me to make the claim, again, I repeat, that there is no moment in U.S. history since the end of slavery where black people weren't stigmatized as criminals? It does not exist. Now, of course, if you're looking for empirical data for that, you're going to have a difficult time validating that claim. And if that's the basis upon which we judge the choices we make in society, then you've already lost the battle. I would argue that the same infrastructure of ideas that came into being at the end of slavery frame to this very day the questions we ask of the research and the evaluations that we do. The same infrastructure shapes the data that we collect and also shapes the interpretations we offer of what to make of that information. This infrastructure is as old as is the wiring in this room. Invented in West Orange, New Jersey, in Thomas Edison's lab in the 1880s. Just as a kind of thought exercise, until we power our buildings and our lives with solar energy and wind power, we might just reflexively take as an assumption that we are still operating with a set of principles about how race shapes everything in our society that isn't much different than it was when electricity was invented. I know that's a little bit hard for some of you to accept, so I'm going to give you a little evidence to prove the point. Here is the first one. First came the idea that certain kinds of people were prone to certain kinds of behavior than others. And the data was fit to the idea. The idea was the basic for the framework of an entire evolution of population statistics in the 19th century, attending to the problem of poor peasants in Europe, gave birth to eugenics, here in the United States to social Darwinism, the founder of sociology. All of this is familiar to you, but yet you discard it as if it's Theory 101 or Criminology 101, and that it does not operate in our contemporary moment. We're so different from those in the past. So let me make a basic claim here, that all of the data which become the benchmarks of our advocacy to any young black and brown men arrested or in trouble with the law, too many young black and brown men in prison, are the basis for the work that we do in youth justice. That's the starting point. Because if they weren't getting in trouble, then we would look at them like we look like the privileged college children on liberal arts campuses around the country. We know that they do self-destructive things, but because there's no artifact of it, which is to say a criminal record, a body behind bars, anxieties reported in the newspaper, all artifacts of behavior, then there's no problem. But the simple fact that our system produces these artifacts, this evidence, then we identify that as a problem. And so that way of measuring humanity, that way of measuring people against people, has a unique history. It wasn't always the case. In fact, in this country, black people had to be freed first before they could be criminals. You had to be a citizen to be prosecuted. And that's an important reminder, because we only accept in this moment that this ordering that happens in our criminal justice system is perfectly natural and normal. Well, first it's a consequence of the choice of citizenship. But then a whole lot else gets added to that. Sociology, social surveys, and statistics happened to coincide with the arrival of a huge explosion of economic inequality in America. So this was the great era of industrialization. This is the era of the robber barons. Sociology itself was a spin-off of political economy, which was far more expansive in its attempt to examine social forces in society as a way of essentially making the case that society had more to do with human behavior than what the biologists or the ethnologists of that day had to say. Which is to say that we can't explain human behavior without understanding it in relationship to society. And it just so happened that that moment coincided with the birth of freedom for African Americans. Why is this important? It's important because the claims that people made about whether African Americans should even be free or not were rooted in a set of ideas that had nothing to do with statistics. God had painted black people black to remind us that their ancestors, the descendants of Ham, had seen Noah in his nakedness, one set of ideas. The others were that God had created different species of people called polygenesis, another set of ideas. Other ideas were that you could measure people's fundamental worth in society by what they look like. By the color of their skin, the texture of their hair, the shape of their nose. But guess what? That was an expansive vision of the differences in humanity because it was tied not simply to blackness versus white, but an incredible array of differences in the shades of whiteness. And as it turns out, the scientists of that day said, well, guess what? Did you know this? The variations among those groups are far more significant within the groups than they are between them. And so there's a particular moment when social survey data and statistics come into being as a way of kind of resolving the messiness of our own DNA. The simple fact that we could not ascribe a kind of fundamental difference based on our biology. We needed behavior. Behavior became a way of helping out. It was an innovation. It was an innovation in the era of what I would call a data revolution tied to the production of population statistics and the analysis thereof. We are not the only inheritors of an information revolution or of big data. How dare you against that? So when we decide that innovation for us looks like an ever greater reliance on the tools of our computers and our social survey data and our ability to produce regression as a way of making us more sophisticated, well, it's really just part of an old practice, an old infrastructure that has been there to help sort people. That's why we do what we do, to help to sort people. So, don't just take my word for it. One of the first voices in this big period was a man named Frederick Hoffman. It's hard to overstate the case, and I don't have time to fully prove it, but this man sat on top of 50 years worth of the production of should be winners or losers in American society. In fact, much of this work was descriptive by the standards of today, but nevertheless, Frederick L. Hoffman helped to put into practice a way of using data or evidence to make certain truth claims about what we should be doing or what we should not be doing. I figure I had to put that slide up too soon, so pay attention to me. The first thing he did was that he looked at, in 1890, the first census that showed that roughly 30% of the nation's prisoners were people of African ancestry, black folks, African Americans, in a population that was only 12% of the general population. That statistical artifact, for him, was meant to be interpreted not as this complicated reality of a kind of political economy of punishment, right? That in the aftermath of slavery, there was contestation over the fruits of one's own labor. And so some individuals are pushing the boundaries of what freedom means. They want to own land, they want to constitute their families, they want to vote as Republicans in a democratic South, all of which were subject to criminalization. All of which were subject to forms of anti-black violence. And if one chose to fight back, one would be subject to counter-violence or a prison sentence or a convict lease contract. Which is to say that Hoffman, nor anyone else of his generation, could ever disaggregate that 30% number. Now, we would like to try today, I know some of you would like to get at it, to try to look at the other social variables operating in that moment so that we could arrive at the actual number that is the authentic representation of the real criminal offending of black folks in the aftermath of slavery. So in that way, we could arrive at a better truth, right? But you have to stop and say, why ask the question in the first place? To what purpose does such a question get put? Well, Hoffman wasn't that sophisticated, and so therefore he simply said that the 30% is actually smoking gun evidence of the fundamental tendencies of black people to commit crimes in society, and therefore that fundamental tendency to commit crimes in society should be the basis of a second-class citizenship. But he took it a step further, and here's where things get really tricky. Because I would argue that most of you operate in a political context that still operates under the same basic premise. I don't need your regression analysis to know that black people and brown people in various parts of the country are prone to criminal behavior. Oh, but does that sound like CompStat or Stop the Frisk? Yes, it does. Okay. So we only have to leave the city to see the relationship between that set of ideas in our contemporary moment and the roots of this kind of very facile way of making certain claims about the kind of democracy people should have in society. But here's where we are even more implicated in these cultural roots. It's not just that people who operate in our midst, who have tremendous power to shape the life fortunes of entire communities and groups of people, still use statistics in a facile way to justify forms of inequality and abuse, but also that they did it in such a way so as to say, we are the good guys. We are the ones who are free of the taint of that old Southern racism that looks like a Bull Connor in the South, or looks like any number of sheriffs who participated in lynch mobs over those many dark days of the Jim Crow period. It actually turns out that Hoffman, as an individual, as an innovator in an earlier information age, using evidence to make certain truth claims, turns out that he actually added this to the mix. He pointed out that there were higher rates of prison commitments in the North, 69 versus 29 out of 10,000, which was to say, essentially, that black people's criminality is more problematic outside of the South in the 1890s. And therefore, because the North is a liberal place, is a place free of racism, is a place that had sacrificed its sons on behalf of the Civil War, therefore, this is further evidence that their criminality is articulated in spaces where white people have no responsibility for their social environment. That's very powerful, because it's also true in our contemporary moment that the highest rates of disproportionate criminality are here in the north, in our northern states, not the south. So we share in common this tendency to have a set of ideas that says, well, in certain places, we can actually hold constant racism and say the behavior is higher, it's because of them, not because of us. It's a fundamental myth of Southern exceptionalism that operates in our consciousness, that takes us back to a time and place in our mind's eye when it was another set of white people who were the real villains in our communities. Well, Hoffman wanted us to know the same thing. Back to the quote, and I'll read it very quickly. His shop was across the river in Newark, New Jersey, at Prudential Insurance. For 50 years, he was considered the dean of statistics in American society. Up through the 1930s, he was single-handedly still producing national homicide data because, as you all know, Uniform Crime Reports was one of the earliest standards for measuring offenses by arrest type, by demographic group. Didn't come online until the 1930s. And so this man built a modern infrastructure that most of us pay absolutely no attention to. But he took the argument not just from what the data said, but he interpreted it. And here was his interpretation. I've given the statistics of the general progress of race and religion and education for the country at large, and have shown that in church and school the number of attending members of pupils is constantly increasing. But in the statistics of crime and the data, the legitimacy of the proof is furnished that neither religion nor education has influenced to an appreciable degree the moral progress of the race. What does that mean? I see a lot of puzzle faces. I'm taking you back to a place far, far away. It means that nothing works. That's what it means. When Markinson writes in 1973 that no program works, so we should just lock them up because they've proven to be incapable and immune from any positive influences in society, this is old. This is a very old story. And in fact, what makes it so old and informative to us is that it's happened at the very beginning. There's no prior history. This is black folk in freedom, the first generation. If you're born in 1866, when Hoffman makes this analysis, you are 25 years old. You are the first generational cohort never to have experienced slavery. And this is the stigma and burden that you carry. There's no moment in American history where this set of ideas is not operating, and operating in powerfully instructive ways. It's not a surprise that Hoffman is an actuarial and has the influence and the reach that he has. It's a private world because the public world has not yet caught up with the potential and the possibilities of what statistics can do to justify inequality. So let's get to that world, because I know that some of you are expecting me to wrap up very shortly. So Hoffman makes a couple of bigger claims. He's made many already, and I don't want to wait too much. You may say, well, geez, this is a lot for one person to bear. But we could probably circulate a list in this room of individuals who have had undue weight on a set of policies and ways of thinking that we still live in the shadow of. And I won't mention any names because I don't want to get anybody in trouble here, but they are with us, even to this day. One of the things that Hoffman did was that he positioned the problem of black freedom and criminality and the use of statistics to make claims that black people didn't deserve to be educated, didn't need access to a liberal state, right? Because that's essentially what he's arguing. Neither religion nor education work. Nothing works. What should we do? Now, the other guy over here, this Mississippi governor, in a longer speech, is only meant to show you the convergence of a set of ideas. In this case, he's making the case that census data shows that the more illiterate black people are, the more northern they are, the more likely they commit criminal crimes. And therefore, to school the Negro is to create Negro criminals. It's dissonant to us. It makes no sense. But if this is what the statistics show, if this is what the evidence showed for how to organize life in that past, it cautions us to the way in which certain kinds of evidence still articulate true claims. But Hoffman had a far more checkered past with the use of evidence, and here's where politics and ideas matter. As it turns out, Hoffman also noticed tremendously high rates of criminality amongst European immigrants. And this is just one moment to capture it. The Irish and Italians show a percentage of arrests decidedly above the average. Now, if we were sound biting that would be proof, according to the leading demographer of crime of this time period, that the Irish and Italians had a crime problem. But yet he used this fact differently, yet small when compared with that of the colored element. Therefore, to illustrate that This creates a space for the Irish and the Italian, subjects of social Darwinism and eugenics thinking with statistics, to actually get a free pass, to move into a different category of opportunity and mobility, and to leave African Americans stuck in this statistical ghetto, increasingly defined by their criminality. One that is rooted in statistics that cannot disaggregate all of these complicated social forces. Now, Hoffman contributed to a set of practices. So here's where your program folks get in the story. Because some of you are social scientists who do program evaluation, some of you are folks who work on the ground in communities like Ruth. And so for those of you, this is your story. As it turns out, what Hoffman did set a framework of ideas that was so compelling that ultimately the very infrastructure that would come into place that we know today as the founding of the juvenile court, the establishment of social settlements in the early period, things that we will certainly take on in a very complicated way about, well, was it even useful that those people touched those young people? We could have that conversation. But I would argue that in this moment, the space that Hoffman initiates with a set of ideas that says that the Irish and the Italian crime may be bad, but it's not so bad, leads to a moment for a robust and sustained 8-decade intervention into those immigrant communities, by comparison to a willful and persistent neglect of black communities. There's no way around it. Now, for the program administrators, I want you to hear this. There's no evidence attached to these claims. So in this case, this is a prisoner reentry organization in Chicago in 1907 called the Central Howard Association. It is defining the problem, which is white inner city crime. It tells us that this is a problem tied to single mothers, too many kids, impoverished housing, abuse of police officer. Look, it's on the corner, car they got away. What you can't see is the saloon looming in the shadows. But rather than pathologizing this entire community, rather than seeing the evidence of the criminality or the juvenile delinquency in the midst as the basis for certain kinds of claims about what these people are worth, or how we should define the few dollars that we have to help, they say, how are criminals made? First principles. And there's a long list here. So long as there are bad tenants, sweatshops with policemen, bad jails, child labor, dishonesty, grinding employers, saloons and gambling dens, so long as boys are taught to fight and allowed to carry firearms, so long as fathers are different deserters and mothers must maintain the family by the watchword, so long crime will continue. I know many of you have made such claims, even to this very day. But the question is, do you do it against the weight of a history and a set of ideas about what kinds of truth claims are valuable based on evidence? That's what I heard today. That's what I hear people wrestling with. And what I want to offer you is that if you knew the history a little bit better, if you knew how we got here, if you knew how the wiring was put into the building or put into your grants or put into the foundation's own set of ideas about what is worth funding or not funding, then you might take a step back and say, are we still living with the past? Are we still sorting with a set of ideas that says we should help these people, not based on statistics, but based on their humanity? That's what's being articulated here with this prisoner reentry organization. And this is what won the day. This is the vision of saving that Jane Addams inaugurated in Chicago as an archetype of a leader of an entire generation. It's not too much of an overstatement to say that what Jane Addams initiates in the progressive era was an infrastructure that very much shapes juvenile justice today. We've not replaced the juvenile court built in Chicago in 1899, back in her own backyard. We've not replaced the idea of the community center as a beachhead against the deprivations that exist in those communities. But the difference is that all of you are much smaller in impact than Jane Addams ever was. And all of you are wedded to a set of fundamental notions that there's only so much you can do for those people. You may not agree with me, but that's the world that you've inherited. That's what you're pushing back against. And Jane Addams had far more ability to redefine and reshape the humanity of the European immigrant, far more so than anything that her contemporaries like Du Bois was able to do in this contemporary moment. Let me conclude then with a much more contemporary example. I've made reference here to the uniform crime reports. By show of hands, everyone know what the uniform crime reports are? Okay. And if you don't know, Google the term and you'll find that quarterly and annually, every major newspaper reports on the latest arrest data, which tells us whether crime is going up in our cities or not. Okay? It's one set of evidence, and in this day, it was absolutely innovative and essential because it represented the first time that the nation, outside of decennial census data, could make certain claims about what kinds of crime were happening in our society. What happens in this early moment? Well, it turns out that the founders of American criminology, Edward Sutherland and Thorsten Saline. How many people have ever heard of Edward Sutherland? Okay, well, everyone here is not a criminal justice guy. I get it now. All right. Well, Edward Sutherland was the American criminologist par excellence of his generation, publishing his first book in the mid-1920s. Part of a larger conversation happening at the University of Chicago or the University of Pennsylvania or Columbia University. Those three schools were at the pinnacle of American criminology and sociology in these early days. Well, it turns out that there was a counter-narrative to Hoffman's articulation of black people as fundamentally criminals, and therefore we should not save them, right? What I have not said to you is that you have to ask yourself, what are first principles? Why are we so committed to producing data to justify what we do in the name of saving people, especially when it's programs that represent a form of entitlement to education, to recreation, to the kinds of pro-social activities that we know happen in suburbia and the college campuses and in private elite schools. Like, nobody's producing any evidence to show that. I mean, you could create program evaluations of every single class that every college student takes to say, what is the measurable outcome of whether or not this is going to change your life or not? It doesn't happen. So, the fundamental necessity for using program evaluation is partly based on the limited resources that we are willing to spend for certain communities at risk. And that problem of what we spend for those communities at risk is predicated on a fundamental notion that some of us are worthy of saving and some of us are not worthy of saving. So Hoffman helped to put that in motion, and Adams' own work helped in practice to create a divergent experience for those who were worthy of saving and those who were not. Okay, so Edward Sutherland is sitting on top of this history, a generation after it's inaugurated, and his job is to look at the latest census data of prison commitments. Now remember, Hoffman set this in motion with 30% over 12% in 1890. And as it turns out, the counter-narrative coming from African Americans saying that we are subject to the political economy of punishment, meaning that we get longer sentences, we're railroaded, we're subject to forms of stop and frisk and racial profiling that were going on in the Jim Crow era. We can't get a fair day in court. There's always juries. We can't testify on behalf. It's like, oh my God, this is a tremendous system of injustice being passed on and perpetuated as just because the census is not capturing all its complexity. Knowing this, one of the founders of American criminology attaches to an early prison report this: the high commitment rate shown for the Negro is probably in some degree due to the combination of lower economic status, less frequent use of other forms of penal treatment for Negroes, and unfavorable race attitudes on the part of the white race. Now this again may seem like a bland thing in this moment, but it's not. It's not compared to what Hoffman has set in motion. But it doesn't last. And what you're not seeing here is the history that helped to produce this moment. This would be essentially what would come out of this gathering if all of you decided to push back against the ways in which we're all divided up and why we can't ask certain questions, and then you produce a new reality. Well, that's this new reality. But it didn't last long. Because by 1933, the same report is saying the most convenient basis for comparing the incidence of crime or prison commitments among various racial or the population groups is the ratio of commitments to population. What the hell happened? What happened to the possibility that we would fundamentally call into question what kinds of truth claims we can make based on evidence, a footnote in this case, compared to co-signing on it, to simply say, will divvy up society based on proportionate offense rates, and therefore we end up with certain truth claims about those people. It turns out that the Uniform Crime Reports were influenced very early on by this debate. And something that most of you probably don't know happened. And I'll ask it this way. Why are there no Italian or Irish American criminals anymore? Why can't we compare the relative threat of those with the last name Kelly versus Giuliani? Does anybody have an answer? Because we don't track Italian Americans and Irish Americans in our statistical record keeping. But we used to. In fact, if you look at early police annual reports at the local level, and you can go to any library that has material that old, and you pull an annual report off the shelf, and you open it up, there are spreadsheets. And you literally have to fold the page open, just like this. Of course, it's crumbling as you open each one up. And at the top, it has the rest categories and it has population groups and numbers for that period that is being recorded. Italian, Irish, Mexican, German, Slovakian, Lithuanian. It's unbelievable how capable they were of assigning nationality to all these individuals as they track their offenses. So why is that not important anymore? Is it natural that we no longer keep track of criminals with the last name Kelly? Seriously. It's a consequence of a set of ideas and political choices that we made because that information was no longer useful to us. And why was that information no longer useful to us? Well, as it turns out, the sociologists of the 1920s and 30s decided that the Italians and the Irish behaved just like the Germans and the English. And so, well, why keep up with all this information? You know, white people, all behave alike. And so they actually pronounced the end of the need to study the foreign-born. And so in the Uniform Crime Reports, and I'm just going to share this with you so you don't just take my word for it, the earliest Uniform Crime Report says to draw any conclusions regarding the comparative criminality of race groups was a caution against making certain truth claims about different groups. In other words, there's disproportionality all over the arrest data. But the footnote there in 1930 was you cannot draw any conclusions about the comparative criminality of the groups. By 1935, this is what it says. The significance of the figures showing the number of Negroes as arrested compared with the number of whites can best be indicated in terms of the number of each in the general population of the country. Foreign-born, first of all, it got collapsed. So we went from all those groups. We had white, foreign-born, black, Mexican, other. So what I didn't tell you is all of those groups disappeared from being Italian-Irish, which was really more local. That was too much for the feds to keep up with. Collapsed that to foreign-born, and then by 1935, eliminated the foreign-born category. So what does that mean? What it means that since 1933, when the Uniform Crime Reports became the basis of any claims about what's going on in our communities, and the basis for so much of the work that you do, we've decided that white, black, and we have other categories now, Mexican, Indian, other, was the most sufficient basis for determining relative levels of criminality in our society. And guess who loses in that construct? First of all, the gaze is narrow. Second of all, the political economy of punishment collapses into the deviance ascribed to black people, which pre-exist at this moment. But now, essentially, you're normalizing any form of white behavior in society as normal against a black standard. That world is with us. Nothing's changed. That infrastructure is right here with us every single day, and we do nothing about it. We don't call any attention to it because when we think about racism in the past, we go back to, again, sheriffs and lynch mobs. We don't go back to the technocracy of our quantitative methods and the ways in which they re-articulate racism and reproduce racial inequality in our society. Thorsten Saline in 1939, just to put a finer point and to conclude on this, it is unfortunate that the belief in the Negro's excessive criminality has made students of Negro crime expend so much energy in attempts to verify the charge. Attention has thus been diverted from much more fundamental matters such as the causes of crime, read social forces, and the relationship of the Negro to our agencies of justice, read racism and inequality and bias. So much time wasted trying to determine how much of those people, how many of those people are actually criminals. So much so that in Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, we have an instance where it calls us to this moment of looking at the past as prologue. Here is a political cartoon from a 1929 Philadelphia Tribune newspaper. This is a weekly black newspaper in Philadelphia, speaking to the history of the criminalization and incarceration of black men in that fair city. Notice the ways in which Michelle Alexander calls our attention to the black man behind bars, behind a moment of the new Jim Crow in an age of colorblindness, to this moment where the Philadelphia Tribune articulates a black vision of criminal injustice and inequality. It says that the Philadelphia Negro, which is Du Bois' term for his 1899 classic study, is imprisoned and incarcerated behind the bars of ill will, prejudice, segregated schools, Jim Crowism. And Ben Franklin looking on perplexed and with great anguish to the city of brotherly love, wondering if this is the basis for democracy in our society. Translation: we have been fighting this fight for a very long time, and it's not going to be won in our program evaluations. It's not going to be won with the evidence. I'm sorry to say. I want to be a little provocative here, so you're free to disagree with me. But the fact is that it's the ideas, as I said from the very beginning, that preceded the data. Before we had the 1890 census and proof that there was a disproportionate number of black men in prison, the first generation after slavery, we had a universe of ideas to substantiate, prove, and maintain racial equality in America. That basis has not gone away. Something more pernicious has come its way. Final point. The University of Washington published a study in 2009 based on a consistent question that is asked in the General Social Survey about the difference between blacks and immigrants in American society. So you've heard this question before. But this particular use of that information and that same basic question was tied to trying to find a smoking gun of racism amongst people who self-identified as members of the Tea Party. So the whole point was to say, if you ask this question and Tea Partiers answered in the affirmative, that proves racism, as opposed to those who self-identify in opposition to the Tea Party will answer it differently. Here it is. Asked if blacks should work their way up without special favors, as the Irish, Italians, and other groups did, 88% of supporters agreed, compared to 56% of opponents. Well, the problem with that, of course, is that Irish and Italians didn't work their way up without special favors. But if we have a population that self-identifies as Tea Party, then we, us liberals in New York, no Tea Party here, say, oh, gotcha, racists. But then it turns out 56% of those who self-identify as in opposition to the Tea Party, read New York liberals, are believing the same thing. The simple fact that the Kellys and the Giulianis disappearing from our criminal ledgers is a function of the work that Jane Addams did long ago, that FDR picked up in the context of the New Deal, and that in the context of 3 decades of the redistribution of federal dollars, not based on program evaluation, based on politics, to subsidize home ownership for working class white folks and educational subsidies to GI soldiers who had sacrificed on behalf of the nation. And although black GIs also were entitled to it, they couldn't spend their money anywhere because the black schools could not provide the infrastructure for them to be educated. And when they tried to get in the white school, as James merited, they could not. So that's a history that we don't acknowledge when we ask such questions, and returns us back to this basic set of ideas about those people and what we ought to do with them. And we run around measuring our approaches to it, trying to justify to the philanthropists and the robber barons of this age that we're doing good work. We need to get back to some first principles. We need to ask bigger questions. We need to ask different questions. We need to push against the boundaries of recidivism as the basis. I know I did not hear it talked about as much here today, thank goodness. But for so many of you, at the end of the day, you know that someone was looking at your work, wondering how many of the people that you work with have reoffended, as if there's a simple linear relationship between what you offer young people and where they end up after that. Ellen Baxter runs Broadway Homes. Anybody heard of Ellen Baxter? She spends, on average, about $80,000 per tenant in these beautiful buildings that she has built for the poorest of the poor in the city of New York. Essentially, she takes people either out of emergency shelters who are clearly homeless and puts them in state-of-the-art, beautiful buildings, mostly in Manhattan. She spends $80,000 a year to do that, because that's what it costs to maintain her homes. And guess what she says? She doesn't let researchers into her operation, because she doesn't want anybody coming along telling her that the people in her building don't deserve the highest quality of living conditions, that the children that work in her building, that go to school in her buildings through programs such as Head Start, don't need to be evaluated, and that the art that hangs on the buildings, on the walls in her building, are so important to addressing and speaking to the humanity of her young people, that she is doing the college preparatory elite educational work that is happening all around us, and nobody is counting. Thank you. I know we're more or less out of time. You want me to take one or two questions? Okay.
Okay, I'm Evan Nashua, and I'm a PhD student here. And it seems to me odd that you are looking to abandon evidence and abandon statistical evaluation at exactly a moment when New York has de-escalated its prison population overall from 72,000 down to 56,000, and is receiving a $4 billion a year dividend from criminal justice de-escalation, where the overwhelming evidence towards marijuana legalization is being quoted, and where we have closed all of these youth prisons. Doesn't it seem, can you at least acknowledge that some of the statistical work that's been done has actually helped people who've been subjected to these racist policies?
Sure, absolutely. The world is complicated, and we heard numerous examples of where evidence has worked to move the reform needle. But somebody sitting on this NAS panel, we know that there are numerous states that have moved in just the opposite direction, which is to say that in a world where clearly climate change is going to be the death of our humanity, in some cases we move the needle, in some cases we haven't. My job is not to tell you what to do with your evidence in the service of change. My job is to call attention to the fact that your evidence has a history, for good or for bad. And the fact that so many of us don't know that history means that some people end up in situations where they are actually redefining or supporting the very infrastructure that is the cause of our demise. So bravo to New York, and bravo to those who have used evidence as the basis for that change. The other caution I would say as a general matter is that we spend a lot of time producing new data based on the latest Bureau of Justice statistics reports. And a lot of people spend a lot of time producing racial disparity data, as if the simple fact of proving disparity in our system is sufficient to the task of transforming that system. So this is a much larger critique, not one that is caught in the specific debate. So I would say use what you got to get what you want. Right? The problem, of course, is that we are not self-reflective enough of a different kind of approach and set of questions that we should be asking of those. I worked at Vera, and I have always said very frankly what I thought about the way that Vera did its work, which is to say, someone else told Vera what it was interested in funding, and it said, yes, sir, master, we'll go out and do it. That's problematic. It doesn't mean that at some instances they didn't end up doing good work. It doesn't mean that somebody out there willing to fund something didn't have the best of intentions and actually produce a good outcome. It just meant, though, that these really smart, talented people could have done so much more by saying, well, let me tell you what the questions are that you ought to be asking and supporting. and sitting and waiting, or saying that the political climate is not sufficient to the task of talking about racial disparity. And I said, no, they weren't even doing racial disparity work 10 years ago, at least that's movement. So that's my point, sir. It's not to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Another question?
Hi. My question is, hi, I'm sorry. The question is, you mentioned that this league is like a monster against the tide to make black and colored people become like white people, where everybody, you don't see the problem, but you see the potential, the human capital. But in statistics also, when you go to school, for instance, in math, they tell you how to lie with statistics. And here we are using statistics, saying that this works, this doesn't work, and this and that. What do you recommend that we should be doing? Because if we're here, it's because we really care. We want to make some changes. So how do we go? What would you recommend?
Yeah, so I think that this is why I started with Ruben and Marlon, because I thought the way that they frame the work that they do should become a best practice for making a larger claim about what we do in our communities. What I do, I don't call crime prevention because it's dehumanizing. Jane Addams, in fact, you saw the slide there, she named a 162-page book, which was everything about the juvenile delinquents of Chicago in the first decade of the century when the juvenile court system came into being. She started with the possibility of naming the book Juvenile Delinquency and Public Morality, but she changed the name to Spirit of Youth and the City Streets. Not because it was an editorial suggestion, but because she decided that in order to capture people's humanity, you could not label them with statistical language until she got rid of the term. My program, Junior Scholars, is every bit committed to the idea that the children that we serve have a right to understand who they are and the conditions under which their communities have evolved, which means they're learning about the history of the criminal justice system. They're learning about abuse of police practices. They're all learning about capitalism and neoliberalism because they deserve to know. Do I sell and market that as criminal justice? Absolutely not. Do I sell and market it as crime prevention? No. Should I? Yes. I get more money, right? If I could say, these ragamuffins, or the fact that it's a bad time to be making this case, and there is a real world out there, but certainly the fact that we put on these people the burden of proving their right to move freely in our society cannot be the basis of how I fundraise for my program, because then I only reify the very question that Hoffman raised at the very beginning, which is, are their crime rates increasing or decreasing? And if their crime rates are increasing, then what we do isn't working, and maybe we ought not to bother. Thank you.
My favorite part of Dr. Muhammad's talk was about 10 minutes ago when he said he wanted to be a little provocative. It also caused me to think about something that Rich Bury said back in the last panel, which is perhaps that evidence and the utilization of evidence-based programs in this whole movement could be a bulwark against politics. And that's, I think, something we often face. You need to speak in these terms today in order to attract the attention and support of policymakers at risk of doing just what Dr. Muhammad said, by playing into all these assumptions in this history. But maybe by having some evidence, we can keep shrinking the incarceration state. But that's a lousy bargain. It's a risk. But I think this has been a very productive morning. And I thank you all for coming. I think it's been fantastic, good conversations. And my colleague Ann is going to come up and wrap up with a few details. And I just want to say one more thing, which will make your neurons fire, which is there's a table on here full of really nice little fruit tarts that you should grab.
So my job is just to thank everyone. I want to thank all Dr. Muhammad and all of the speakers, the facilitators of our panel. I want to especially thank the Pinkerton Foundation for making this possible. scenes people. Kendra Gentry, this was a labor of love for a very long time. Kendra, would you just stand for a minute? And Kendra is a part of a very large team that includes Melissa Pognon, who